evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and I am delighted to see so many of you here with us tonight. Thank you for taking the time to join us for what promises to be a thoughtful and candid conversation about the forces that have reshaped journalism and where we go from here. At the CJF, our mission is to support excellence in journalism and to convene conversations that strengthen our industry and our democracy. Tonight is very much in that spirit. Before we begin, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to TD Bank Group, the exclusive sponsor of our J-Talk series. TD's leadership and commitment make these important conversations possible. We're also grateful to Cision, our in-kind supporter, for helping us amplify this work. On behalf of the CJF, I have the great honor of welcoming Richard Gingras this evening. Richard is the former Global Vice President of News at Google and one of the most respected international voices at the intersection of media, technology, and democracy. Over the course of his career, from early digital journalism ventures to shaping Google News and working closely with publishers around the world, he's played a central role in how news evolved in the digital age. He also currently serves as chair of the board at Village Media, where he continues to support and strengthen local news. Few people have had such a front row seat to the internet's transformation of journalism, from business models to distribution to public trust, or have reflected as thoughtfully on what that transformation has meant for democracy. I've had the pleasure of knowing Richard for many years, and I can tell you the thoughtfulness he brings to his work is exactly who he is in person. He asks tough questions. He's always willing to back an innovative, smart idea, and he's never afraid to wrestle with the big issues. Richard is also endlessly curious, and that curiosity has taken him from digital news experiments to flying his drones in search of a new perspective, and at certain news gatherings to leading a high-stakes game of werewolf, where you quickly learn that media leaders are very competitive people. This is a particularly timely moment. With Richard's recent departure from Google, we have a rare opportunity to hear his perspective on how the publisher-platform relationship evolved, but also what could have been done differently and what needs to happen next. Richard will begin with a talk, and following his remarks, he'll sit down in conversation with Angela Pacienza, executive editor at the Globe and Mail. Angela is helping shape the future of journalism at the Globe, finding new ways to connect with today's audiences while protecting the core of what good journalism is all about. She understands the pressures and the possibilities of this digital era firsthand, and she's always thinking about how newsrooms can evolve and move forward. We're also very lucky to have Angela as co-chair of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. We'll have time for a Q&A at the end of the program, and you can ask your questions at any time using the QR code on the big screen. Richard cares deeply about these issues. Angela is leading through them every day, and together they'll help us understand where the media landscape stands and what it'll take to build a healthier information ecosystem in the years ahead, particularly as journalism navigates the next frontier of AI. Thank you for being here, for supporting the CJF and the future of journalism. Please join me in welcoming Richard Gingras.
Thank you, Natalie, for that extremely warm introduction. And thank you also for your long work and the work of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, which I've long admired and have always appreciated engaging with and will continue to do so. I've had a remarkably fortunate and indeed accidental career, 5 decades in media, technology, and public policy during a period of enormous change, from working at the Public Broadcasting Service in Washington when it raised the ire of the Nixon administration with gavel-to-gavel coverage of the Watergate hearings, to working on Google search during the era of the internet. In 1975, an early mentor told me, if you're interested in the future of media, stay close to the technology. It establishes the playing field and the ground rules upon which the game of media is played. That was not obvious then. It should be extremely obvious today. We face a matrix of challenges in our digital societies. I don't come with answers as much as I come with more questions. We can then find new answers, which will trigger yet more questions across the ever-changing matrix of media and its impact on society. It was a warm September Saturday in Manila in 2023 when Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa had asked me to give a speech at her conference called Tech for Good. I had known Maria for many years, since she founded the news site Rappler, before she suffered the tyrannical rage of President Duterte, before she and her team feared for their lives, before a storm of criminal and civil suits nearly destroyed her. I had agreed to address the problem of polarization in our societies. I spoke, as I will today, of how our digital world has dramatically altered public discourse in good ways and bad. I shared insights and ideas that various institutions, including the press and tech companies, might consider in addressing our challenges. Several hundred people gave it their full attention. The moderator then turned to the audience for questions. A British journalist took the microphone. She was very direct. She conveyed her outrage at my audacity in criticizing the press, saying, "You and your company, Google, have destroyed democracy." Her words staggered me. Now, I've had considerable experience with confrontational engagements about the challenges of our digital era, including some very theatrical experiences testifying before government bodies around the world, including before Canada's Senate and House of Commons. But this was different. This was personal. It accused me of such heinous negligence that our structures of self-governance were left in shambles. That I felt the journalist's claim was an incorrect provocation did not matter. It stopped me in my tracks. I struggled with the intense emotion behind her words. Either I was wrong, or this journalist was laboring under a dangerous misunderstanding of how the internet impacted our societies. I didn't think I was wrong. Nonetheless, I reconsidered my own analysis, my own efforts during these decades of tsunamic change. If I was wrong, I needed to know what was right. If I was right, I needed to better explain how we got here so that others might find constructive paths forward. There's a lot of hand-wringing about the challenges of our digital world. We see the many benefits, but we fear the increase in polarization. We fear our democracies will die. We seek blame and punishment. However, without a deeper understanding of the causes, we risk the damage of ill-considered solutions. If we reduce the blame to a meme, blame social media, we devise solutions that might counter the meme but not address the true cause. I studied the evolution of media further, if only for my own tranquility. You might find my analysis useful, success for me, and you might disagree, but success for me is simply stimulating a rethinking of how we got here, even if your perspective does not change. We believe in a free press and free expression. We believe in the self-governance of a democracy. We believe a society can tolerate its differences and find constructive compromise. We believe all of those things. But there's a paradox in that. History tells us quite loudly that the greater the freedom of expression, the greater the fragmentation of perspectives. As a result, the far greater difficulty in achieving compromise, and worse, the far greater difficulty for democracies to thrive. Our societies are fractured. We see deep fissures of ethnic, religious, and economic conflict. We see a crisis of divisiveness, driven by fear of the other, by fear of the future. Some fears are justified. Others are stoked for political gain. We demonize those we disagree with. We see them as the other. We portray them through simplistic accusatory memes. In doing so, we deepen the divide, we do not bridge it. We see a failing democracy. We see less willingness to engage in constructive dialogue. We see less trust in government. Pew Research says it has declined from 80% in the 1960s to 20% today. More troubling, only 20% of Americans think democracy is a good model for other countries to follow. In Canada, that number is 44%. I wouldn't say that's anything to be proud of either. Better, but not by much. How did we get here? Is this unique to our contemporary digital world? Why do so many people believe democracy has failed? Can democracies survive our digital age? Can democracies survive the internet? Democracies live or die on our ability to find common ground, to grow a shared consciousness, to consider complex issues and find compromise. Democracies break when the desire for compromise is lost. No, the problem did not start with the internet, though the internet did exacerbate a centuries-long trend. There have been disruptions at every step in the evolution of communications, from the printing press to radio to television to the internet. The reason is this: as our ability to express ourselves becomes easier, we encounter more points of view and experience more conflict. Gutenberg's printing press was as disruptive as we see the internet today. Yes, it broadened access to information. It also challenged the dominant institutions of the day, governments and the church. Without the press, the religious tracts of Martin Luther would not have spread. Without the press, Martin Luther's challenge of the Catholic Church would not have triggered the Reformation. We think of the Reformation as a theological dispute. It was actually a revolution in media that enabled revolutions. Like the internet, the printing press brought the benefit of shared knowledge. Indeed, without it, the Industrial Revolution would not have occurred. But like the internet, the printing press was also capable of spreading falsehoods. Early printed tracts included religion-infused diatribes against the Muslim world. Mysticism went viral with the early printed word. There has never been an golden era of truth. The modern era of electronic communications, radio, and television followed. In the 1950s, the media ecosystem in the United States was an oligopoly of 3 commercial networks, public broadcasting, and cities served by 1, maybe 2 newspapers. Those outlets offered a selective view of our society. Some say that homogenized view had its benefits, though voices at the margins, whether extreme or simply unheard, were largely out of view. Marginalized voices were shunted to the unlit corners of our culture, to mailed newsletters and niche magazines. Some say this was the heyday of trusted mass media. But did it present a true sense of our collective psyche? Or was it only a gauze hiding unresolved cultural fractures? Has the Civil War ever ended? In 1987, the elimination of the fairness doctrine in the United States triggered the rise of highly partisan talk radio, which formed silos of belief and inflamed them. The same fearful beliefs we see today were seeded and made viral then. In the 1980s and 1990s, cable and satellite networks fragmented the media environment further, spawning fiercely partisan news outlets, each feeding a loyal partisan audience, both leaning toward affirmation rather than information, with fact-based coverage drowned in a flood of opinion and political bias. Polarization had taken root. That was 30 years ago. Then the internet broke the information space into 1 million shards, from 500 channels to 1 billion voices. We choose voices that reflect our view of the world, that reflect and confirm our biases, good, bad, or indifferent. With each advance in communications, we see more voices, more fragmentation of beliefs. It is mathematically divisive, and consequentially, politically and culturally divisive. Our divided society resists compromise. Politicians focus on their core supporters with no desire to reach across the aisle. They define and contrast themselves against those they despise. Compromise is off the table. Compromise is the enemy. Plato's prediction that free expression would doom democracy to the appeal of an authoritarian's simple dictates seems uncomfortably valid. Plato predicted the paradox that a society with unrestricted free expression is vulnerable to the hard-fisted demagogue preaching a simple path forward while spreading misinformation, inciting hatred, and undermining democratic values. The internet elevates both noble speech, which appeals to our better angels, and heinous speech, where outrage and self-righteousness foment a blind hatred of others. Supporting free expression requires we tolerate speech we find disagreeable, even heinous. Sadly, many believe in free expression only to the extent it's acceptable and agreeable to them. We demand it be fixed, but how? The Global Center for News, Technology, and Innovation provides objective analysis of public policy affecting the free press and the open internet. I sit on CNTI's board along with Marty Barron and Maria Ressa. The challenge we find is that policies managing misinformation can easily undermine a free press. How do we define acceptable versus unacceptable speech when problematic speech comes from politicians themselves? What speech do we disallow? What defines fact versus fiction? What is awful versus lawful? What guidance do we give platforms of communications and amplification? What form of fake news policy is not potentially a tool to be misused by others in power? Who decides that? Managing free expression in an open society is a contradiction in terms. I'm not suggesting we can't benefit from smart public policy, but it offers no silver bullets. We in the journalism community must look at our own efforts, rethink how we earn trust, how we guide society toward consensus, how we evolve the role of journalism in strengthening the communities we serve. Let's consider the question of trust. We hear often we must build trust in journalism. But that's like saying we should generally trust politicians or used car salespeople. And Pew Research tells us all three professions have very low ratings of trustworthiness. Journalism is not monolithic. It varies in quality, approach, and degrees of partisanship. We may speak of journalistic ethics, but adherence to those ethics is neither comprehensive nor consistent. There are no applicable laws, nor should there be in an open society. What can we do? Might we build news organizations that bridge the gaps of divisiveness, that gain respect from across the political spectrum? Building trust with a partisan audience, eager to hear the confirmation of their biases, is easy. That's not trust. That's affinity. That's blind loyalty. Building trust across chasms of divisiveness is hard. It's called mutual respect. I'm not a fan of partisan media. By definition, they align with a specific political movement or point of view. In a polarized world, partisanship widens the gap, it does not bridge it. It is the problem, not the solution. Our objective as journalists is not to tell people what to think, but rather to offer the tools and information that allow people to draw their own conclusions. My ideal motto, we inform, you decide. Some question whether we can be objective in such a fiercely partisan world. Objectivity is not about one's beliefs. Rather, it's a rigorous discipline of critical thinking that pursues facts accurately and fairly, regardless of whether they align with one's personal beliefs or political agenda. As Marty Barron suggests in his superb book, Collisions of Power, we should expect journalists to be objective, just as we demand that police and judges be objective. In the world of media, trust must be constantly re-earned. Hannah Woodworth suggests borrowing from philosophy the frameworks of epistemic arrogance versus epistemic humility. She says, perhaps we should frame the contrast between journalists who assume they are trusted because of their profession, which is epistemic arrogance, and those who recognize the need to interrogate their own credibility and methods, which is epistemic humility. How do people develop trust in information? First, we trust people we know, and those endorsed by people we know. We trust people who are more like us. We are tribal. If the head of the tribe says the moon is green, we say yes, to be sure we get a leg of the calf at dinner. Trust is first and foremost a social construct, whether we like it or not. Second, people trust in institutions, maybe their church, their government, a charismatic leader, or a specific news source. Trust in institutions can deteriorate and shift, as we've seen. Third is through information architecture. Academic and scientific journals are more trusted because they're reinforcing architecture, Each article a fact-based narrative with footnoting, data transparency, and peer review. Wikipedia has a rigid architecture of footnoting and a refined fact-based narrative. They build trust by explaining their principles through the structure of their work. Information architecture in news is problematic. At the macro level, a news brand, like the New York Times, features a mix of fact-based journalism surrounded by ever more opinion. The Times continues to make political endorsements. The architecture of fact-based journalism packaged with partisan expression is counterproductive. How can we build broad-based trust in fact-based journalism if it is surrounded by opinions that suggest otherwise? Can we reduce the perception of bias by rethinking the information architecture of the article itself? And by respecting the audience we think should respect us? Today, with the capabilities of AI, we can go beyond storytelling and possibly build a deep knowledge architecture around a subject, one that offers a living corpus of reported information that audiences can consume and indeed query. Janet Coates is a linguistics researcher at the University of Florida. Her research on the coverage of the George Floyd protests found that nonviolent protest actions were repeatedly described with words like spark, fuel, erupt, trigger, ignite. Professor Coates poses the question, is the recurrent use of such language a deliberate choice, or is it a subconscious pattern? Might that not influence the perception of political demonstrations? Might that not fuel a partisan divide? Language matters. Politicians know this. They spend lavishly to learn which words and phrases will stimulate the desired response, be it hope or fear. We in journalism should also study linguistics. We should assess the impact of the language we use. We should be cautious in amplifying the false memes and spin propagated by the politicians we cover. Professor Coates is now building tools that reporters might use to assess language bias and strive to build trust across the divide. We live in a landscape of distorted risk. We vote with unfounded fears of terrorism, crime, or whatever ills the body politic is inclined to make us fear. We fear terrorism despite the fact that we are 11,000 times more likely to die of heart disease in the United States. We fear crime when we are 28 times more likely to die in a car accident. Context matters. Lack of context can cause harm, more harm than errors in fact. Maybe it's an unconscious oversight in the blur of breaking news, but sometimes it's not unconscious. It's fear-mongering. Either way, news coverage, absent of fact-based context, is a form of misinformation. Might we close the gap between irrational and rational fear? Today, we live in a world with artificial intelligence, powerful tools that can impart more knowledge than any single one of us can master. AI will be increasingly valuable to our society in virtually every dimension, from science to industry to journalism. But we also fear AI being misused. Justifiably so. AI will be misused. Here, too, we need to understand the challenges before we can address them. Last fall, here in Toronto, I attended a Geoffrey Hinton lecture series event that focused on a simulation where an AI agent learned the strategy of blackmail to protect itself. What struck me was that this was presented as the evil machine working against us as the AI rising to kill us all. To me, that was an incorrect targeting of blame. How did AI learn blackmail? It learned from us, from humans. It learned from history, from current events, that blackmail is our go-to strategy. What is the threat of high tariffs, but not an application of blackmail? Yes, we fear AI. But let's acknowledge the true nature of the problem. The problem is us, not the theoretical evil machine. Given the weaknesses of our species, I would argue that we need AI to save us from ourselves. Public policy alone will not fully protect us from malicious AI. Good public policy will only be followed by those willing to do so. AI models can be trained on ethics, can be guided towards altruism, but the dark players, the outlaws, won't do that. So we must be proactive in building AI solutions that counter the dark forces and move our society forward. In journalism, we must individually and collectively learn and adapt to the superpowers that AI can provide. Let's talk about rebuilding community and self-governance. In 2000, Robert Putnam published the book Bowling Alone, the result of decades of research on the correlation between effective governance and community engagement. Putnam's insight was powerful and simple. In regions of ineffective governance, people were joining clubs. They weren't joining clubs or going on picnics or joining bowling leagues. They weren't getting to know people different from them. They weren't building social capital. The causes won't surprise us. Back then, it was the rise of television, increased suburbanization, and now the internet. We're increasingly isolated. We show less empathy. We lose the opportunity to understand the challenges and attributes of people who are not like us. And if we don't engage with the other, we more likely see them through an isolated silo of fear. How might we bring communities back together? How might we rethink journalism's role with a mission to strengthen our communities? We can do this. A recent mega-study led by Stanford said the best way to address divisiveness is to engage the community on non-controversial subjects which can unify the community and build the trust to address more difficult issues. This emphasizes the value of going beyond watchdog journalism, holding power to account, and addressing a community's broad information needs. What's going on this weekend? Who died? Who was born? Will the storm close the schools? It is this useful day-to-day service journalism that provides value, grows trust, and builds a shared reality. We all care about the potholes being fixed. We would consciously celebrate the community's hopes and dreams, giving focus to its successes, sharing examples of civic empathy, not just what went wrong. Yes, we do watchdog journalism, explaining local issues, exposing criminal behavior, and ferreting out corruption. But the audience for accountability journalism is small. By addressing a community's broad information needs, we expose accountability journalism to those who won't seek it out, thus generating more impact. Beyond the newsroom, we would seek to engage the community with each other, both virtually and in the real world, to develop a shared consciousness, to build social capital. Can the 60-year decline in community engagement be addressed by renewed approaches to local media? This is not just an idea. Organizations are exploring such models. The most advanced is right here in Canada, a publisher called Village Media, which has established itself in nearly 30 communities ranging from Sault Ste. Marie to more recently in the downtown core here of Toronto. I engaged with Village informally for more than a decade, and now I chair the board. Village has proved that such models can be effective and profitably self-sustaining without a subscription paywall, which means everyone in the community can benefit from what they do. Village validates that local advertising is both a source of valued community information and the lifeblood of the local economy. A recent study by Northwestern said the primary motivation for consuming local news is, guess what? Save money. Yes, knowing what's on offer from local merchants or what I might afford to do with my family this weekend is valuable information. In addition to its newsrooms, Village has launched a community social network called Spaces that connects people on locally hosted topics of common interest. To sidestep toxicity, Spaces emphasizes non-controversial subjects. Yes, there's a space for those maintaining classic cars or exploring the local music scene, but not a neighborhood watch where a dark hoodie is seen as an intrinsic source of fear. Spaces connects virtual discussions with real-world engagement. The local brew pub can host meetups of the woodworking group. The classic car group schedules regular parades. This creates the social capital that Robert Putnam tells us is critical to effective governance. Let's take this one step further. Might we try new models of consensus building? Lawrence Lessig notes that democracies were not always electoral. Historians like Montesquieu and Rousseau tell us that models of electoral representation have their weaknesses. They can lead to autocracy and away from democracy, or to what Alexis de Tocqueville called the tyranny of the majority. Not surprising in an us versus them political environment of forever campaigning and unlimited financial contributions. An alternate approach used in Athens and in the French republics was sortition. These were randomly selected citizen assemblies that deliberated on key questions of the times. Recent efforts in Europe, like the Bürgerrat Demokratie in Germany, or the citizen assemblies of Ireland, supplemented the parliamentary process by addressing issues like same-sex marriage and climate change. Village Media is also exploring such models by identifying key community issues like the opioid crisis in Sault Ste. Marie and activating a protocol that leverages ongoing coverage by the newsroom and mounting local citizen assemblies called community conversations. Village is in effect building a community operating system to enable communities to address their challenges and strengthen themselves. It's not easy, but we have to try. Our challenges are complex. We can find answers if we step back and rethink the models from every dimension. We need thoughtful leaders in all sectors, media, technology, academia, politics, to be role models, to be leaders with a more principled view of the common good, leaders who can help us define what the common good is. I've long been part of the journalism community. We need to recognize that it is on us to advance our role in society, and in doing so, show the value we expect society to see in us. There are no messiahs. I trust we know that. Public policy won't assist us, might assist us, it won't save us. More likely, it could work against us. Philanthropy might assist journalism, but it won't save us. It is not a pillar to bet our future on. I say none of this to be negative. I say this to encourage our focus to be where it needs to be. I say this to myself every day. It is on us to fully absorb that free expression means accepting there will be expression we find heinous. It is on us to recognize we cannot and should not force our truths on the truths of others simply because it won't work. It is on us to accept that while we may think journalism is a public good, there are many who see it as a tool of self-interest and manipulation, whichever side of the political spectrum they might be on. It is on us to rethink what we can do to empower our divided societies to engage and strengthen ourselves. It is on us. I thank you.
Hi, everyone. Got your popcorn? Doing well? Nice to see so many familiar faces, and welcome to the new faces if this is your first CJF event. Richard, thank you so much for your thoughts. You've given us a lot to chew on, a lot to figure out. I wanted to start, given your extensive career, I wanted to just, look at platforms and news publishers, the strategic choices we made and how we adapted or didn't adapt over the years. Looking back, what's one assumption platforms like Google got wrong about how news organizations would adapt to the open web?
It's a very good question. I think, first of all, it's important to understand that these companies, including Google, which I have tremendous admiration for, extraordinarily principled people, they did not innately understand journalism or how it works, right? I came into the organization with that background, which was useful, but it wasn't native to them. I think in their minds, given who they are, technologists, is you're always innovating, you're always changing, and easy for us to expect that of others. We neglect to understand the challenge of being disrupted, right? The disruptor's dilemma, the disruptee's dilemma. And I think that was particularly true in the journalism space, in the news industry. I think the news industry was particularly susceptible because they were coming out of a period of immense success, right? As I point out often, in 1985, the Dallas Morning News was the internet of the community it served. But now with the internet, there's simply a news node on the internet, right? People go to the internet for all kinds of things that they used to go to the newspaper for, and particularly many of the things that actually drove their advertising, right? When were the movies playing? So on and so forth, the stock quotes. And so I think we did not recognize just how difficult that was. I didn't recognize, in spite of the fact that I spent more than a decade and a huge amount of money trying to drive innovation, but it's hard and it's slow. And I understand it. At the same time, I can be frustrated by it because I look at the news industry and there are obviously great examples of people who have found a future, have found a path forward. The Globe and Mail is one. Obviously, the New York Times is another. But I think so many of them spent, as is common in disruption, spent time looking backward saying, how can we basically make the internet turn around and respect us for what we did? Versus turning around and saying, how do we understand this dramatically different marketplace of information and find a way to adapt to it? Mm-hmm. And to this day, by the way, I don't know what I would have done differently knowing that, because I just think it is an innately difficult challenge.
That was going to be my next question, so there goes that.
Well, I will tell you, I'll tell you, interesting, there is one thing. Because curiously, Google at core as a business is an advertising business, right? Extraordinarily successful and in incredibly innovative ways. One thing I often tell people, 2/3 of Google's advertisers are small businesses that could never afford to advertise in the prior world because it's incredibly efficient. At the same time, what I missed, what I actually learned from Village, was there is still a significant opportunity in local, basically by merchants looking to allow the community to be aware of what they had on offer. But I think we, like a lot of people, just said, oh, advertising isn't a part of the business model anymore. But that's incorrect, particularly at that level of local news.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on to AI, because the history repeating itself, the potential is there, and the disruption never stops in this industry. What do you think is the biggest, I guess, the risk the publishers should be watching for as AI becomes this intermediary between audience and journalism?
In a sense, the same dynamic they faced with the internet. They responded to the internet with fear. And too often, not everyone, too often they're responding to AI with fear. And you can see it, and it's understandable. I work with newsrooms, I work with journalists. They understand it's concerning, it's a huge change. It means that their jobs will be different. They fear their jobs will disappear. But to me, that's the solution is not to ignore it. The solution is to aggressively go after it. I often quote a really thoughtful journalist by the name of Gina Chua. I quote her because this is not something that would ever wisely come out of the mouth of a Google executive. She was heading up an organization called Semaphore, and she was very aggressive. She's now at CUNY, very aggressive looking at how she could use AI to do better journalism. And she was challenged by her newsroom. And she said, look, I'm going to tell you flat out, my priorities 1, 2, and 3 is to do great journalism, and I'll use whatever technology I can to allow me to do that. I do not have a priority to save your jobs. But I will tell you, if you're concerned about your career, then as I point out, adopt and adapt to the superpowers these capabilities give you. One more point in this regard. I was in a board meeting recently with another media organization, and they were laying out their plans for the next year, and AI wasn't mentioned. And I said, and what are you doing with AI? And the response was, well, we have a measured view of how we're going to look at AI. And I went, if I might challenge you on that, without question, you should be extraordinarily careful in maintaining your principles and your ethics. But beyond that, you should be aggressively digging in to what this can do for you. And it can do a ton, right? I mean, any organization today needs to be, in every component of the organization, thinking, how do we use AI to do what we do better? Whether that's on the commercial side or on the news side. I look at, if I may go on for a second, 10 years ago when I was at Google, we introduced a project called Living Stories, which was really based, with Google search and Google News, like we cluster all of the coverage on a story, kind of like a living story. And we said, it might be wise for news organizations to kind of do the same. You do a whole lot of reporting on a subject over time, but you don't cluster it. Why don't you cluster it? Another opportunity for users, and by the way, it'll actually put you in a better position for us to see what you do. But it was hard for them to do because it required a lot of extra effort. Now with AI, you could actually do that almost automatically. And so that's what I'm saying, like rethink what's the architecture of news? What's the evolution of the story itself in this time frame? Sorry, I didn't mean to go on so long.
No, I think that's great. So then as, I guess, those are some good lessons to take forward. And one of the things I always talk about in our newsroom is like the only thing we're guaranteed is more change. We're never going to stay still, right? And so we just have to keep going. So, as news leaders are thinking about AI, you sort of gave the example of inside our newsroom what to do. What about the relationship with those companies? Don't wait. You can get into specifics if you'd like, but there's like lawsuits. There's some people want to work with them, some don't. Are there lessons from like the past about whether you work or don't work? Because a lot of people, I'll be honest, like we feel like we got burned by Facebook or by whoever, and you don't want to repeat that. So some of the fear is legit.
Yeah, I deeply understand that. And obviously I've been in the middle of it on both sides, particularly obviously on the platform side with Google. But here too, one thing I suggest is like, step back and really carefully analyze what's going on. For instance, one thing, I've had these conversations with the folks at the Globe and Mail. They stole our content to train their models. And I go like, well, let's think about that. Now, yes, and there are lawsuits going on. And the courts will adjudicate those against copyright law. Now, copyright law, you can't copyright facts, you copyright expression, right? So frankly, I would be troubled if there were a significant change in copyright, because we want the information and the knowledge to spread. I go back to Jefferson on this. Thomas Jefferson was the creator of his day. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He invented all kinds of things. The revolving door, Thomas Jefferson. And he said that patents and copyright were an insult to an advanced civilization. And he understood the practical reality that should exist, but he said there's got to be a balance. And look at now, we look at copyright on a basic novel in the United States. It's the life of the author plus like 75 years. And I go, what the heck is that about? Nothing's going into the public domain anymore, right? So I think we need to step back at this and say, what is best for our civilization? Now, I'm not saying, I don't know how these things are going to play out. There's the question of what will they license, so on and so forth. But there too, my guidance to people in the news industry is make sure you understand the realities of the value of the content you produce. Because commercially in the ecosystem of expression, news content doesn't have much value. Because guess what? It expires in hours. And there's a lot of it, right? If you look at, folks would come to me at Google Search and they say, you know, you're making money off our content. And I go, wait, we're just linking to you. And by the way, if you look on Google Search and see where the ads are, you don't see ads against news queries. Because guess what? The last time I saw an ad on a news query was like the last time Obama had a book. Where you see the ads is like travel queries, health queries. That's where the value is. But that's also information that has longer value. So I say, fair enough, go after companies and try to get as much licensing revenue as you can, but do not for a second think that that is going to save you, because it won't.
And you think communities is what will save us?
Well, from a democratic standpoint, the work of Putman just like kind of went to my core. And it did when it came out. And by the way, there's a brilliant documentary on Netflix now called Join or Die, which is based on his work. And it just, to me, that's just so profoundly logical. Like, how can we find consensus if we don't understand our differences? If the only way we think of an immigrant is someone who's come here to take our jobs away, that's a problem.
Yeah, for sure.
But as we all know, every one of us knows how it changes when we know people who aren't like us. Look at the situation, frankly, with gay marriage. How did that change over time? It changed over time as more and more people knew people in that situation. And then they weren't the other.
No.
They were us. And our views changed along with it.
Yep. So just to go back to AI, should news organizations there is going to be sort of an AI-driven information war, potentially, or what does newsroom resilience look like against that?
I mean, first of all, it's going to be entirely based on the trust you can build with an audience. And this, too, I think is something that the news industry in the digital era didn't really pay enough attention to. How do we, because Google search would send a lot of traffic. Obviously, the opportunity for publishers was to turn that traffic into a loyal user. So that loyal audience is crucial to the success of the business. That respect is crucial to the role you provide. The role that we provide is the fact that we done well, that we are presenting with people with fact-based information. We are verifying. So for instance, another thing that's come up recently in newsrooms where this is a cultural challenge, and a lot of saying we don't want anything to do with AI. And in fact, I've been seeing a few cases where they say, if AI has been used in the creation of the article, then we need to put a little bug at the bottom of the article that says AI was used in the creation of this story, and by the way, AI can make mistakes. And I go, what? That's an intellectually backward thing to say, right? To me, the policy in a newsroom around AI is nothing's changed. Your job, you own your words, you own your work. You're a reporter here or an editor here because we trust you to have verified your sources. We didn't put a bug on the bottom that said, oh, by the way, we went to the library for research or we went to the World Wide Web for research. We assumed you did your work. So with AI, what's different? It's an extraordinary, powerful tool. I mean, anyone here who is not daily beginning to engage with one of these great language models like Claude or Gemini or OpenAI, you're missing something. It's just amazingly powerful.
How many people in the room, I can't see it totally to the back, but how many people use AI like every single day? Ooh, I like that. That's awesome. All right, good to see.
You know, I mean, if you're facing medical issues, you know, taking a lab report and feeding it to an AI and have it explain it to you, like, you know, doctors don't do that very well.
Okay. Let's turn to another topic that might be on some people's minds, and I think I'm going to know your answer, but I'm going to throw it out there. You know, Meta's possible return to news. We've heard some rumblings in Canada that, you know, because the trade negotiations with the United States are going to open things back up, the Online News Act is again on the table, and that might herald, you know, Facebook's return, Meta's return. Does it even matter if they came back? Is AI sort of disrupted everything so much? Should we be optimistic, cautious?
I suspect it doesn't matter, but not for the reasons you think. And you know, I spent, 4 years working on the C-18 issue in Canada. Know it well. And from the beginning, I said, this is not going to work out well. You know, you're asking us to pay for links when, at least what I did at Google was like every way we could provide links to get people into the content, we would do it. So why would you want to tax the links? Here's the problem. It's going to be very difficult to unwind, particularly in the social network environment, because I think it didn't take C-18 for social networks like Facebook to start winding back on how they surface news.
Yeah, they were doing it before.
For two reasons. One, and I worked on a social network at Google, a link out of the environment is broken engagement for them. The second, and this was backed up from my sources at Facebook when they did pull out, engagement with Facebook did not change, did not go down, user satisfaction went up. And not surprising for the same things we know of news avoidance, right? People don't want to read about negative stuff, and news, unfortunately, is largely about the anomalies of the world where things go wrong.
Yeah, I hear you on that. The news industry has not done a good job of giving people like the dopamine hits that the social media companies immediately knew.
I don't even say it's the dopamine hits. I mean, we've been thinking about this a lot at Village. It's like, you know, by definition, you're covering the stuff that went wrong. And if you're not actually thoughtful about it, you can just as easily present a very distorted sense of your community. It's like what I was saying about the landscape of distorted risk. Did that murder just happen? Is that a singular event, or is that a trend I should be worried about? But beyond that, if we're not ambitiously and thoughtfully covering what's good in the community, if we're not reinforcing examples of empathy in the community, how do we expect the community to feel good about themselves and want to be empathetic towards others?
But I would argue, you know, I agree with you. I think a lot of the reason I have heard in the past why we don't do those types of stories where we call them solution stories or the happier things or what's going well is the community doesn't generally click on them.
I don't think that's true. I don't buy that, but at least they should be there. Mm-hmm. But the human interest story, one of the more charming ones I read in one of the local publications was about this 75-year-old, which I'm 74, by the way, I should point out, you know, who was looking for this long-lost love from 60 years before. You know, it was a tremendously heartwarming story. There are lots of heartwarming stories. People do read them, and they get a sense of them. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be a mistake for us to reach that conclusion that because it's good news, people don't want to read it, that all we want to read is about you know, fear of calamitous death.
Mm-hmm. I hope you're right. We're doing quite a bit of it, and I would say with mixed results. Some things are doing very, very well, and some things I think it's challenging to get readers' interest in there.
And some of it is all even how we write about the bad stuff.
100%, yeah.
You know, I'll stop there, but I could go on.
All right, well, I got a 5-minute warning that we're going to head to audience questions shortly. So I wanted to do a little rapid fire fun. Start with polarization, what you talked about, and then move into journalism. What is one misconception about polarization you wish people would drop?
That if we think carefully and look at our inner souls, we all demonize. And maybe we shouldn't.
Okay.
I don't like to get into political discussions because in what I'm doing, my political strategy is an apolitical strategy, bringing people together. But I look at the divisiveness in our United States, and I say people who say, I cannot talk to anyone on the outside, on the other side. Anyone who voted for that guy, I can't talk to them. And I'm like, you might want to look closer at that. There are lots of reasons why people voted the way they voted. And be careful of you simply assuming it was the worst reason, especially in today's world. So much of the votes was like fear of lost jobs, fear of a declining economy. You know, how do we do better? So, yeah, we have to be careful ourselves about not demonizing, about in our own little ways, trying to reach out to people and build relationships. Sorry, that wasn't fast.
What single change would most quickly improve trust in journalism?
Humility.
If you could retire one newsroom habit forever, what would it be?
The anecdotal lead.
Opinion next to news, you touched on this. Necessary context or harmful blending?
I think it's hard. You know, here's one of the things that happened in the digital age. If you go back 40 years, the opinion section of the newspaper was like 100 pages long, and you had an editorial page that was one, and you had the op-ed page that was another. That was all the opinion. You know, opinion is cheap. Everyone has one. They can write them quickly. So if you look at the digital age, the proportion is hugely different. Now, I asked Marty Barron about this. Marty Barron is as brilliant an editor and as pure a journalist as ever. When he was editor of the Post, I asked him, I said, how are you comfortable with there being so much opinion against your fact-based journalism? And he gave me a very honest answer. He said 2 reasons. He says, 1, it doesn't report to me, and it didn't. It reported to the publisher. And second, he says, it's very popular. But I think it's problematic. I don't know. And if you look at the research on trust, you see that all the time. Right? I can't trust the New York Times. They're left-leaning or whatever. Same on both sides.
All right, the last one before we get to audience questions. What is one thing local publishers should stop chasing immediately?
It bleeds, it leads.
Oh, okay. All right, so you've got the QR code up there. They're going to come through my phone, so bear with me as I go through some of the questions. Good ones are coming in, which is great. Okay, here's the first one. Are publishers still too mesmerized by big, shiny American tech companies? And if so, why do we keep repeating that pattern?
I don't think they're really mesmerized by American tech companies anymore.
Anymore, that's true.
You know, I mean, I was at Google for 15 years. And early on, I'd go around the world because that was my job. And it was like there was a glow. I mean, they would bow down because I was from Google. That was absurd. Now it's at the other extreme where there's, you know, brickbats and 2x4s waiting to hit me in the head. So the balance is somewhere in the middle, but I don't think anyone's mesmerized by big tech anymore. Almost to a dangerous point.
Here's another one. What do you say to digital journalists or industry pros who say that search and SEO are dead?
We're just not seeing it in the behavior. Search will change. You know, search will obviously take greater and greater advantage of. Look, just one thing about Google. Google's long-held mission was to organize the world's information and make it accessible and useful. What it was not is Google's role is to organize the websites of the world and link to them. So no question, and frankly, as you see the evolution of the web, that becomes ever more logical. My favorite example, and all of you have done this, do a recipe search on Google. And you know, what you get is hundreds and hundreds of recipes, and if you click on one, each one gives you the history of the knife and the fork and wheat and how it was threshed. And then, after about a mile-long scroll and 150 ads, you get to the ingredients. Well, guess what? That's a tragedy of the commons. It's not helpful to the user. So not surprisingly, on Google, if you look for a recipe for pound cake, we're going to give you a recipe, they, not we, going to give you a recipe for pound cake. And yes, if you want to look at 1,800 other variations and are willing to go through the slop, then you'll get to it. So I think actually my own view is that if you're a quality organization, then you will continue to benefit. If you're a poor quality organization with poor quality experiences, you will suffer. And I honestly don't have a problem with that. I do think it's unfortunate that the web, but it's, one thing I think that's consistent over time, there's always been, there's wheat and there's chaff. Mm-hmm. There's always more chaff than wheat. And that proportion has never changed. So yeah, you got billions of websites, and guess what? 750 million of them aren't great.
Here's another. As independent media platforms proliferate and mainstream media erodes, it seems clear there's going to be a vanishing point for the foundational basic information the new players need to do their jobs. Is there an opportunity for Canada to lead the way in becoming an infrastructural source of the trusted factual information that is essential for the future?
Certainly, and not just Canada. And by the way, one thing I'll note, and I said this when I testified here a bunch of times, Canada has an extraordinarily innovative collection of emerging digital players. I would say easily as good, if not better, than any other place in the world. And I spent 15 years around the world just doing that. And then I look at the public policy battles here, and as I said, it's like, you're just smacking the emerging digital players in the head. Because everything that was being done and considered was basically the benefit of the big and the legacy, with almost no accordance for how do we drive innovation. Because if we were doing anything right, we would figure out, well, how do we have public policy that drives innovation? In whatever way possible, whether it's through tax policy or constructive investments in innovation, not simply trying to prop up past models that don't work, right? I mean, the Globe and Mail isn't succeeding as it is because you're relying on handouts from others. It's because you and your leadership, David Wamsley, Philip, did such a great job of stepping back and saying, how do we rethink this? And your very noble ownership, for that matter.
Mm-hmm, absolutely, but some places don't have that.
Some places don't have that.
So.
But that's why, I say, get out of the way. And here's one of the unfortunate things about disruption with legacy players. The problem with being a legacy player is, like, you have to innovate going forward, but you've got this legacy background. And what happens as a result is you think, we need to do this differently, but in many cases you just make a compromise. You say, oh, well, we used to do it that way, we should do it that way, so we'll slice it in the middle. The emerging players don't have that, right? I mean, that's why in startup ventures, startups tend to get great progress because they've got a clean canvas to innovate. So, let's help those out.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Here's another one. What is a bigger online threat, misinformation or inauthenticity? I
mean, both are threats. I think, again, in all of these cases, it's like, it's back to your early point about big tech. When people blame big tech, I said to me, the problem with simply blaming big tech is you avoid going deep and understanding the true nature of the problem. Because I guarantee you, and I have debates with people all the time on this, it's like, oh, if Facebook didn't exist, polarization wouldn't have happened. And I'm like, have you studied anything? It's too simplistic. And you don't see the real problem for what it is, much less attempt to solve it.
I've had a question here for you to elaborate, I think, a bit more on the architecture, particularly of individual articles to improve trust. What would that look like in practical terms?
To me, if I can explain this briefly, and I think you probably know this from discussions with your own editor, Mr. Walmsley. You'll hear discussions in the journalism community saying, well, but AI doesn't have judgment. AI can't be creative. And I go like, don't think so. In fact, I often would say myself, AI, the language models can't be funny. But recently, and I posted this because it was just too good, I was sitting around with some friends back in the States, and I said, like, maybe given the nature of our struggling country, we should take the failing states and sell them to the benefit of the rest. And so I went to Gemini and I said, here's this idea. By the way, it's parody. Will you write a news story about this?
Okay.
And it was brilliant. And one just capsule in it was, so as part of this, this great liquidation, which was the title of the piece, announced by the U.S. government, was that North and South Dakota was sold as a pair to Costco. And in this article, they had gone to a resident of Fargo, North Dakota for his opinion on this. And he said, well, I hear Costco has great health care. And I hear they're thinking of putting a pop-up in the state capitol. If I can get a hot dog for $1.50 while I'm renewing my driver's license, I say hats off to the new management. It can be funny. It's great. And so to me, and this is, David Walmsley uses the phrase, as you know, there have always been reporters who are great reporters, gatherers of information, and reporters who are great writers, sometimes both. And I think in the world going forward, you got to put much more emphasis on the gathering and less on the presentation, because you can use AI to help you with the presentation in 18 different forms. The 600-word piece, the 2,000-word piece, the TikTok piece, the video piece. Yep. So focus your effort on gathering every bit of information you can and then see what you can do with it, because that becomes your vital asset.
Yeah, creativity, curiosity, discovering the new.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Here's another question. I've been reading about the slow decline of social media as engagement drops, driven by growing mistrust in the quality of information and the rise of AI-generated content. What's your perspective on social media losing ground as a source of news? Do you think people are turning more to reliable alternatives?
Well, first of all, when people say that, I always cringe when people say, 60% of Americans are consuming news from social media. What they don't ever describe it as it sounds like that's their only source of news. Like, of course, if your definition of news is anything that's new and interesting to me, then frankly, hearing about my daughter's child having a new tooth is news. But no question, social networks are changing. I'm still a heavy user simply because all of my extended family and friends are there. But we're seeing new things. I mean, I mentioned what Village is doing with Spaces. It's not a social network in the classic sense. You're not following people. You're not posting into the void. You're following a topic of interest with a host and pursuing that. So I think it depends on how one defines social networking. These things will evolve. And hopefully they don't evolve further into silos of belief. Like some folks have said, well, Google has 90% market share. Maybe we should break it up. And I go yeah, you could do that, but play out the scenarios, because that could mean that you get, here's the left-wing search engine, and there's the right-wing search engine, and so on and
Don't
so
we kind
forth.
of have that now?
Well, we're kind of seeing that.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll see that in language models. And by the way, when I say that about the power of AI, it's obviously not all perfect. And like anything else in the world of information, news and anything else, determine what is the right source, right? So if you're guiding your children, it's like, well, pick the right model, or multiple models, and make sure you're picking one that is indeed trying to do the right thing. You know, one of the things, just in a sense, in defense of Google, what was very powerful about being that successful and also being that trusted was it caused you to really think carefully, particularly about matters political. You know, when people would challenge us about bias, a politician would say you're biased. My best defense was saying we surface a diversity of sources and perspectives about any given issue. We let the user decide.
All right, last audience question. And thank you, everyone. There's been a ton of great ones. What role should journalists play in community building without becoming marketing machines or sacrificing independence?
Well, I'll tell you, because again, with Jeff and the team at Village, we think a lot about this. We're very careful in how we define roles, because I mentioned like some of the things we do where we have a community impact protocol, identify an issue, help the community solve it. The newsroom does what we want, we expect the newsroom to do, cover the issue, right? When it comes to arranging the community conversations or bringing stakeholders together to talk about an issue, that's done by a separate team, right? And it's very important that we keep them separate. So you're doing the civic engagement work. The newsroom, you're covering these things. The only thing we ask of you in covering the things is to think carefully about is, again, humility, not arrogance. You know, how do you make sure that we're doing everything impartially to build trust? We don't do political endorsements, right? Because we want everyone in the community to engage with us and hopefully find reasons to find more commonality and less difference.
Globe and Mail stopped doing political endorsements as well.
Yeah, I mean, the whole business with the Washington Post back then were like so absurd for so many reasons, because they just said, we're not going to endorse the president, but we keep endorsing everything else. My main point about political endorsements was like, please introduce me to the 6 people who changed their vote based on the political endorsement of a major newspaper in as polarized an election as we just had. And you're like, how arrogant is that? I'm sorry, that was a little bit rough, but
No, we love that. I think that we're out of time. So thank you so much. I think Jeff is coming up here, but that was good. I have some takeaways.
well, I thank you. And again, you know, I hugely appreciate what you do. And you know, as you hope you detected from this, I'm not suggesting any of these things are easy. It's all very, very hard and very, very complex, but either we grapple with that complexity and address it, or we're not going to have a future, not just as journalists, as a society. So I thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I am an AI-generated hologram of Jeff Elgie, CEO of Village Media and the co-chair of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. I'm actually not an AI-generated hologram, because if I was, I wouldn't need to have my bifocals with this small script I have in front of me tonight. On behalf of the CGF, I want to thank Richard and Angela for a great and thoughtful conversation this evening. There is some dispute historically between Richard and I about who reached out to whom first, and I should note that I have the email proof. It was December of 2016, just over 9 years ago. Village was young. Richard had mentioned us in an article in the National Post. The only problem was I had never met him. To have the vice president of Google News globally reference what we were doing was pretty special. So on a whim, I reached out. I tracked down his email address somehow and figured out, why not? At Village, we have a rule, don't ask, don't get. Sure enough, Richard responded within hours. That led to a video chat between the two of us, and the rest became history. Richard, thank you. You've given all of us a bit of a reality check tonight. I think it's easy to blame the internet and the platforms or the algorithms for why the world feels so divided today. But you reminded us that the real challenge is much older and much more human. You challenged us to stop pointing fingers and to start looking in the mirror. The big takeaway for me is that journalism has to become more than just shouting the news. If we want people to trust us again, we have to be useful to them. We can't just give people things to be angry about. We have to give them the facts they need to live their lives and understand their neighbors. For your decades of wisdom and always pushing this industry forward, thank you. To my co-chair at the CJF, Angela, thank you, sir, for such a sharp and candid interview. Your perspective, both personally and from your role at the Globe and Mail, is incredibly valuable. To Natalie Turvey, all of our staff, wonderful staff at the CJF, it's a small but mighty team that punches way above their weight. They do tremendous things in such a small group. The Canadian Journalism Foundation is really the heart of conversations like this, and events like this happen because of Natalie and the staff's work, so thank you very much for that. I want to extend our thanks to TD Bank. I believe they're here in the audience today. They are the exclusive sponsor of our J-Talk series, which make these conversations possible. We're very grateful for your support again and your shared commitment to the future of journalism. For all of you in the room tonight, thank you for joining us and supporting the CJF. We encourage you to learn more about us. I believe all of our websites, social media addresses, etc., are behind me on the screen. Please do follow us, though. The foundation does some tremendous things that are really important for society. So thank you very much again. Angela, Richard, that was great. Really appreciate your time and being here. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.